everyone. Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide podcast. Hopefully you're no longer a novice at this. You're moved on to journeyman, and you're a master like Josh and myself. We're in good shape. At this. We are still novices at the entire thing, yes. I am, of course, Dan. Josh is my co-host.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
And on this podcast, we'll be discussing all things Earthdawn, magical, mechanical. Especially tonight, I think we're going to do emailical. I'm going to pull that trope again. And we'll cover some spellcasting, so definitely magical.
Yes.
Threadical. No, we go from there. But by all means, we have some listener emails to get to. And just as a reminder, since we have 2 new emails, thanks, guys, please contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Sorry for my voice. It's going to fade on me for a minute or so. But we'll get right to those, actually. First one we have is from Scott. Thank you, Scott. Hi, guys. I'm liking the podcast, and I thought I would ask a question. The elemental clocks stopped falling in 1415, but Thrall started sending out annual scouting parties in 1409, 6 years prior to that. Does this imply that Thrall had some foreknowledge about the quote-unquote end of the Scourge? Thanks.
That is a great question. It's kind of a follow-up to our discussion of the history, the timeline of the Scourge and Thrall from last episode. So it's a great question. And that's a good pickup. We didn't actually address that at all in our discussion, but
true.
And I don't remember now offhand whether it's mentioned in the 4th edition GM's Guide, but I know it is mentioned somewhere at some point in the books that part of the reason that Thrall did in fact start sending out parties early was not because they knew that the Scourge was over, as much as they suspected that the Therans might not have been completely honest about when the Scourge was going to end, and thought that they might have given it a later end date to give themselves time to arrive and take control of stuff before the cares in Barsafe started opening and whatnot. So they started sending parties out in order to see for themselves and not take the Theron's word at what was going on. So, yeah, no, that's a good pickup and a great question. And it was not so much that they knew that they were just playing the game of, well, we don't trust what they told us, so we're going to check for ourselves.
Page 26 in the GM's Guide, actually, the answer you're looking for, Josh, may have even been written by you. Theron predictions, suspecting the Therans may have given conservative estimates to their subject nations, planning to be the first to reclaim the surface.
Yep, there we go.
So, yeah, that's as close as we can get to yes.
Yeah, so
I don't know.
Yeah, again, it's not that Thrall knew; it's that Thrall was being skeptical of the information that the Therans had given them.
Wisely so, because it is the Therans. All right, second email comes from Brian.
Hi, Brian. I actually know Brian. He's played in games that I've run at Gen Con.
Nice.
So yeah.
Thanks for chipping in, Brian. I love his full email address, and just reminds me that gaming is an all-inclusive community. So every profession you can think of plays.
Yep.
So Brian wanted to drop us a line. Let us know how much he's enjoying the podcast. Thank you, Brian. We appreciate it. I also particularly enjoyed the shout out to Ronin. It's absolutely one of my favorite movies. Brian, you and I can hang. We're good there. If you haven't seen it, please go watch that. I'm also writing because I do have a question about the wizard spell Flame Flash, page 344, he says.
I assume
is it just me?
The player's guide.
Player's guide, yes. So is it just me, or is this spell pretty powerful? Maybe it's just that the wizard in my party rolls really well for damage. With respect to the duration, the spell notes that it is 2 rounds. The rule at our table has been that this means that it affects the target twice. Is this right? I know this applies to other multi-round spells as well. However, this is pretty much the only combat one that my spellcasters use. Parenthetical, the others tend to be party buffs that the spellcasters weave an extra thread to in order to extend the duration. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Brian. Josh?
Yeah, I'm taking a look here. I'm not 100% sure that the duration is actually correct on that one.
Fair.
I'll need to double check with Morgan, to be honest. He's the keeper of the minutia of the rules changes and stuff. The 2-round duration that is in place for a lot of those spells, like Mind Dagger, which is another first circle wizard spell, has a 2-round duration as well. But the duration on that is what applies to the physical defense penalty that results on a successful casting. That's on 345 of the player's guide. And so the damage only happens once, but it is the debuff effect, the penalty that lasts for the 2 rounds, basically the remainder of that round after the damage is done, plus the next full round. Remember, I was talking last week about how durations, we have them kind of so that they at least have a potential effect. And I don't know but Flame Flash does not have any kind of secondary effect like that. And I'm not sure whether that means that it actually does will +5 damage twice, that is once each round, or whether that is something that is a artifact of the at one point in the previous before release version, it might have had a secondary effect. So I'm not.
Yeah, I remember in previous editions, spells like Ignite and Flame Flash probably had the first round it does X amount of damage, whatever it may be. And then the next round, you take it down 2 steps because the fire is beginning to die out.
Right. And it strikes me that as a first circle spell, will +5, even as a physical armor reducing, is kind of high for that to happen twice. But by the same token, it only has a 10-yard range. So you're generally doing it when you're up close and personal with someone. And it requires a thread. So that is kind of a counterbalance as well, is that until you get into Journeyman Circles where you have an enhanced matrix to hold that thread pre-woven, you're only going to be casting that spell every other round. And so at that point, it ends up being roughly equivalent to the Neithermancer Astral Spear, which is a first circle spell that I believe does will +4. Astral Spear. It does will +4, but it's mystic and it's got a longer range. So I'm not, I'm not 100% sure. I do like looking at it because I haven't actually played with a wizard in a while in 4th edition. So it is a good question. I will have to look into that. I'm not sure. I mean, with the extra threads increasing duration as well, again, that might be an artifact of something from a pre-release build. But yeah, I'll have to check with Morgan. So we'll get back to you on that.
Check next episode. We should have an answer soon.
Or I'm going to shoot a message off to Morgan here now and see if we get an answer back before the end of the show.
Oh, cool! Look at that, instant podcast. Won't catch that from anybody else. Just teasing. So, I think this is going to lead into our very much longer discussion that we have planned for tonight. I think we only got one more topic because we tend to running about an hour and 15 for some of these. So this next topic is going to run us probably the entire episode.
There is a lot to cover.
Because this question asked by Brian leads us into the perfect thing. Last time around we covered basic. Actually, I have one quick little funny thing first. So to speak of Flame Flash, you have to the spellcaster actually make crackling and whooshing sounds. I assume sounds like a fire. Do you have sound effects that you can do for this?
Me personally,
Josh?
Actually, like right curious. Now, no.
Okay, I've always had a good fire sound effect. My brother liked it a lot, so I can do it on command actually. So it's so I do that one. That's my whooshing sound. Anyway, sorry. We're going to talk spellcasting for the rest of the episode. Since we covered combat last episode, we're going to cover spellcasting this episode. That should cover the groundwork and the mechanics for all the disciplines we're going to cover after this. So now everybody's covered. If you have any questions about how to do combat when we get to like warriors, come back to the last episode. If you have any questions on how to cast spells and what the threads mean, then come back to this episode, hit the generics again, and then go back to your discipline of choice. as we hit them one at a time. So, the basics of spellcasting.
Yes.
Where should we begin? Weaving matrix, weaving the thread, copying the spell into Grimoire. we got plenty of places to start.
Yeah. So,
okay, let's assume that we're heading into a combat of some kind. Okay, because most people are going to use their spells for combat, or slightly before or slightly after, maybe. I don't know. Let's assume they're going to be in combat. They've already got it in their Grimoire. They've done this spell once or twice before, maybe, or it's new. But they at least know it, and they know how to cast it.
Okay, yeah. So
how about we start there?
So you've got your new character. You start already knowing some spells. So we're not going to get into the whole thing about learning new spells. We may touch on that later as things go along.
Yeah, that's a two-parter episode right there.
That's sort of an advancement thing. So let's actually, before we get into that, let's talk about Matrix. Let's talk about the different types of spellcasting. Well, no, let's talk.
Okay,
let's talk about the different, because you've got basically, you want to cast a spell. There are three different approaches that you can take, all of which follow the same sort of broad template, which we'll cover in a few minutes. But the three sort of different categories. The first and the safest and most common is matrix casting. And this is sort of where Earthdawn takes a nod to understanding the need for game balance in one sense. Mm-hmm. And that is where Dungeons and Dragons, to use the sort of iconic counterexample, limits spellcasters by only allowing them to cast a certain number of spells per day. And depending on the edition, the flexibility of what spells you have available to cast for those slots is greater or lesser. But the basic idea is that you can cast three, for just pick a number out of the air, you can cast 3 first level spells per day, and once those are done, you're exhausted, your options are exhausted, and you need to basically sleep overnight, wake up in the morning, and then do whatever your preparation is. And that's basically how the limit is that you've only got so many shots per se of your spells. And as you gain power, you get more of them and various things. Earthdawn,
which always made me wonder if D&D spellcasters were solar powered, because they have to do it in a solar cycle.
It's a nod, I guess, to Jack Vance. It's because it's sometimes called Vancian spellcasting, because it refers to a novels by the author Jack Vance, and how many like in the, I think it was the Dying Earth novels of his, they had like casters could only do so much a day because of the way that world was set up. So I've heard. I've never read the books myself, so, but that, I mean, it's called Vancian spellcasting, so that's the general gist.
Yeah.
Anyway, Earthdawn does not limit its spellcasters in that sense. There is part of the argument is that, well, if everybody has magical abilities, okay, and a sword master is effectively using magic every time he tries to hit somebody with his sword, and is not limited on how many times a day he can do that, does it seem fair that a spellcaster would be limited in how often they can do that? To maintain sort of the consistency of the way that magic sort of works. And the answer to that basically comes out to be no. Okay, well, understanding that, with that as the answer, you need to take sort of a nod, at least in some regards, to looking at some kind of game balance as a concept. How do you limit that? And the way that Earthdawn limits that is with what are called spell matrices. And that is basically you have a number that a matrix, and a matrix is a talent, much like melee weapons is for a sword master. But a matrix is a talent, and it holds a spell ready to go. With a spell in a matrix, you can cast it, as frequently as you are able to. There's no limit to the number of times per day that you can cast any of your spells. You can bring any of them to bear at any time, subject to the limitations of how it all works. But the limit basically in combat, because combat balance is a very different thing from non-combat balance.
Agreed.
Combat balances spellcasters by limiting the number of spells that you have safely ready to go at any one time. Right, so a first circle, a brand new spellcaster will have 2, maybe 3 spell matrices, depending on how they do their initial build. In 4th edition, you do get 2 matrices for free.
Yep.
But basically, you put a spell in a matrix, and if it's in a matrix, then you can safely cast it. And we'll get to the whole process of that.
You can have up to 2 or 3 ready to go. Yeah, so you can have up to 2 or 3 ready to go for your combat. If you've got 6 or 7 spells based upon your perception step, then pick the 3 that are going to work for you in the upcoming combat. So almost all spellcasters have to be somewhat of a slight planner. Have to think ahead a little bit more than just, I'm going to draw my sword and hit the guy. That's a different thing.
Right, yeah. They're just generally speaking, spellcasters and spellcasting are a little bit more advanced when it comes to the play options and stuff. So yeah, there's a little bit more that's going on there. And if you're a player who likes to sort of plan ahead and solve resource puzzles, that is
that's a good way to put that.
Like trying to figure out the best way to use the tools that you have, but you have a limited spellcaster. I love playing spellcasters in Earthdawn. I mean, I like playing spellcasters in RPGs in general, but I really like them in Earthdawn just because of you get a broad toolbox to figure out how to apply to your various situations.
Yes, and most spells have some serious what's the term I'm looking for? Whoop ass to them.
They can, yeah.
They can, and yeah.
So to step back here real quickly, I already have heard back from Morgan. Morgan says that it is in fact correct. The Flame Flash spell does do its damage twice. So yeah,
will +5 both rounds.
Will +5 over both rounds, but it does have the one thread, which we'll get to what that means here shortly. And it is reduced. It is very close range and reduced by physical armor. So there are downsides to that power.
And armor always counts, so that's good to know. But it does bathe your opponent in fire, so that's always a good thing. But there we are. So matrix casting is our first type of casting.
Matrix casting is the first type of casting, and we'll get to why matrix casting is a good idea when we get to the third type.
Yes, I know what that one is.
Okay, so if that's the third type, which we'll get to in a moment, what's the second type?
Grimoire casting.
Grimoire casting. Okay, can you talk about Grimoire casting?
Oh, no, because my characters have only ever done Grimoire casting twice when they've found a spell in a care somewhere, and I'm like, I have to cast this thing right here on the spot, and there's a whole paragraph or 3 or 4 steps on how to do so and the tax that comes across that character to get that part done. So, and my voice is fading. So I'm going to punt on that one.
Okay.
But I can help fill in on the raw casting. I said, only because my spellcasters have done very little Grimoire casting over my entire career.
Well, the Grimoire casting is, in a sense, kind of, it's similar to, how Grimoire casting works depends on what edition you're talking about.
Good point.
In first edition, so basically, broadly speaking, Grimoire casting is similar to matrix casting, except that you don't have the spell ready to go instantly. You generally need to take a little bit of time to prep the spell beforehand. Now, there are some limitations and whatnot that spring up with that, depending on which edition you're talking about. In first edition, the original iteration of Grimoire casting, the only spells that you could cast from a grimoire were spells that you did not already know yourself. The idea behind it being, if I'm recalling correctly, that it was intended to be more of a story/plot device, which is to say that when Like, you find an old grimoire that has the spell that will stop the horror in its tracks right then, and you don't have time to actually learn it, or maybe it's a higher circle spell than you could normally cast safely, and things like that, that you could then use that old book to cast the spell. This is actually used in the second official Earthdawn adventure, Terror in the Skies. The climax of that adventure actually does involve one of the spellcasters in the group using a grimoire they found in the care to banish the horror that's causing the problems. And that part of what's going on with that big final battle is the rest of the group kind of trying to protect them while they weave. It's like 4 threads and whatnot. So it was originally intended as kind of a plot device, as a story device. And so you could only cast spells that you did not already know as a character. But you could cast spells that were higher than your circle. Matrix casting, you can't cast anything higher than your circle. If you're a second circle character, a second circle spellcaster, you can't weave, or you can't cast spells from a matrix higher than second circle. Grimoire casting, you could get around that.
So a question begs is, and I'm going to lead into this real quick, which is, therefore, does the grimoire, to ask on behalf of most of the fans, does the grimoire act as the matrix that filters the magic so that you can cast it? In first edition, that was basically the case. I don't recall that it was actually sort of specified at all. I don't either. I just wanted to make sure that it made some kind of logical game balance sense.
Yeah, because in first edition, grimoire casting was so very seldom used that I don't think the question ever really needed to be addressed. I don't recall offhand, and I don't have my first edition book right to hand to check, but it didn't have anything that was in that section about needing to worry about taint and damage and stuff like that, like you do with raw magic. That was not a particularly popular option when it came to sort of player desires. Like, why can't I cast a spell that I know? Why can't I cast a spell from my own grimoire? Like, there was never any really satisfactory, like, magic theory explanation as to why you couldn't do that. That if you can cast a spell from from somebody else's grimoire, a spell that you don't know, why can't you do that from your own? And so later editions basically tried to find ways to do that, to make that option available and try and figure out a good game balance way for it. Because effectively what ends up happening is that allowing magicians to cast spells from their own grimoire basically gets around the limitation of spell matrices. Basically.
Fair.
You know, if the balance thing in combat is that you only have 2 or 3 or 4 or however many spells ready to go at one time, but you suddenly allow them to cast from their grimoire, all of the spells that they know now become available, and the matrices are no longer a balance factor.
Yeah.
And so generally what was done, and I have not looked at second edition in a while to remember specifically what they did, but third edition did this and second may have as well, is basically when you are casting a spell from a grimoire, whether it's your own or somebody else's, whether it's a spell that you know or a spell that you don't, the grimoire does in a sense act as a filter, which is to say that it will not hurt the caster to do it, but it might hurt the grimoire. And so there was a chance that if you were casting spells out of your grimoire in areas that were not safe the same way that raw magic would be safe or not safe, you could risk damaging your grimoire, or potentially, in the worst case scenario, having the grimoire end up getting marked by a horror, which is a bad situation. Especially if it's your own grimoire, because frequently, though not always, and we're going to talk about this in a future episode, a grimoire is frequently, though not always, a pattern item for the magician that it belongs to. Frequently, but not always. And so having that be marked by a horror is a bad situation. 4th edition did away with... Did we do away with the damage? I don't remember now. I do remember the one thing that we changed. So the one thing that does need to be done with Grimoire Casting in 4th edition is that you do need to spend a round preparing or attuning to the spell beforehand, which is...
Yeah, page 265 has the resolving raw magic effects from casting out of a grimoire.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. Yeah. Basically, so you can you can cast from a grimoire, but it's as if you attune beforehand, that basically this is how we balanced it in 4th edition. I'm looking at the pages now. This is pages 264 to 265 in the 4th edition player's guide, if people are interested. Basically, if you have time beforehand, you can attune the spell to the grimoire. And this is basically it's much like reattuning matrices, and we'll get to that maybe a little bit later. But basically, you have to take 10 minutes to essentially prepare the spell beforehand, and then you have it available to cast. But because it takes time to do that, you only can do it if you have time to prepare. It's not something that you can whip off in a moment in combat. I mean, you can, but if you do it on the spur of the moment, it's as if you're casting raw magic. So you might as well just be casting raw magic, basically. Yes. That's the balancing thing there, is that you can attune a grimoire to do it ahead of time if you're able to prepare. Otherwise, the process is more or less the same. Now, the advantage to casting from a grimoire, if you have time to prepare, is that if it's your own grimoire, if it's a spell that you already know and you are casting it from a grimoire, you automatically get, if it's successful, a bonus success on the result.
That's a nice thing to get.
Yeah. So it's really good. Basically, it's the idea being that you are going to cast from your grimoire if you have the luxury of time. That the purpose of casting from a grimoire generally has been shifted to, this is something that you do when you have the time to prepare, when you are safe at home doing work, and basically as a result, your spells are a little bit better. You can kind of do it quick and dirty, but it's going to hurt the same way that raw magic does.
I equate this to a real life skill of cooking, which is I can kind of whip out dinner if I need to, just with ingredients out of the fridge, versus I have a recipe that I need to follow that I may not remember all the steps for, and I need to keep that book open and reference it often as I'm cooking.
Right. Generally speaking, like, if you have time to prepare, like, it's not a bad idea, like, if you're going to be going into like a combat situation, but you know you're going to maybe reattune like one of your defensive spells in your grimoire, and then cast that to get the extra success, which usually means a longer duration or something like that, so that you can then have more combat spells ready to go, or something along those lines. Now, when you attune a grimoire, again, we're talking 4th edition, when you attune a grimoire, you can only attune one spell at a time, and it takes 10 minutes to do each of them, and the attunement lasts, you make a test, and the attunement lasts for 10 minutes per success. So you can do it, it doesn't last a super long time, but generally it could, if you have time to prepare, give you maybe an extra spell to have handy to bring into a combat situation, fingers crossed.
Yes. And you can, 4th edition still does allow retuning on the fly, correct?
Oh yeah. We'll
just
get
a higher target number to get.
Yeah. The basically what's happening in 4th edition when you're attuning a grimoire is you are turning the pattern of the spell that is in the grimoire into a matrix, a temporary matrix, basically, is what is happening. And it only lasts for a certain amount of time, but in all, the difficulty is the same as if you're reattuning on the fly. It just takes a little bit longer. And so I just think from a magic theory standpoint, it feels a little bit more cohesive because now you can do it. But there's game balance behind it. And so going back to our D&D example, they didn't have a
reason as to why. Advance notwithstanding, they didn't exactly. They said, we just need to have a game balance, but they don't have a real world application to put behind it. Here in Earthdawn, they actually did put something behind it, which is you have to prepare yourself. It's magic. You're casting magic through your body from astral space. So you're drawing from the primordial plane-ish through yourself into this matrix to filter it out, clean all the guck out of the way, and then do what it's supposed to do. And so matrix casting has its reasons. Grimoire casting does the same thing. And finally, we have our third one.
Yes.
Right? Which is raw casting.
Magic.
Which is not exactly the world's... I mean, in a last-ditch effort, by all means, do it. Only if you really, really have to, and you really don't like your character a whole lot anymore because they may not survive. It's a real big risk.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a risk. It depends on where you are and what's going on. True. And there are ways to potentially, if you are cunning, to maybe mitigate that risk a little bit. Like it's generally not something that you're going to want to do in the depths of Parlength. But sometimes you really, really need a spell right now and you don't have time to like reattune on the fly to be able to cast it safely. Or maybe it's a spell that you know that is higher than you can safely cast from a matrix and you really need it. And so you will raw cast it.
This is what heroes do.
Yeah, well...
and a lot of dead ones.
Well, I'm remembering the line from the movie Serenity, which is, you know what a hero is? A hero is someone who gets other people killed.
Love that movie and everything about it. So I'm with you there. So raw magic is kind of like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters. You're dealing with positron colliders and raw things happening from the ethereal plane that shouldn't be messed with in that fashion. I mean, and not for the weak at heart.
Generally speaking, the thing about the horrors is that they pollute and corrupt astral space by their very presence. And unfortunately, if you were to just grab that astral polluted energy, it's going to damage you. It's going to hurt you. And what a spell matrix is as you mentioned earlier, it's a filter that allows you to filter out the safe energy from the polluted energy and therefore cast the spell without taking any injury upon yourself. And it requires a little bit of preparation. That is to say, you need to put the spell in the matrix ahead of time. Whether you do that in the long form, 10 minutes of meditation, or the quick and dirty in the middle of combat reattuning on the fly. You're doing that. But raw casting is basically just grabbing the nearest handful of magical energy and chucking it at something. Basically.
Yes.
And
this has to work.
The amount of damage that it can do depends on how polluted astral space is. And there's basically sort of 4 levels of that, from the everything is safe, which is quite often in places that were in cares that did not fall during the Scourge. Like a lot of the space within the Kingdom of Thrall is probably safe.
Yes.
There's open, which is like there hasn't been a horror around here nearby in quite some time, or it's just kind of general wilderness. There's
open plains,
tainted, and then there's corrupt. And corrupt is like there was a horror doing a lot of nasty stuff here recently, or there was a horror that has gone through here not too long ago, and stuff like that. And the amount of damage that you take is in relation to how polluted the space is and how powerful the spell is that you're casting, because the more powerful the spell, the more energy you need to power it. The other thing that happens whenever you cast magic, really, is it also basically sends up a sort of signal flare in astral space, and a matrix also dampens and hides that flare of energy. If you do not have that when you're casting a spell, it is going to light you up like a beacon in quite a long ways around. And if there's anything close by that might want to come and mark you or snack on you or something like that, it will probably come and start taking a look.
Yeah, you look like the anglerfish in the deep ocean. This thing is just flickering, and they can see that miles and miles and miles away through all the blackness. So.
Yeah. And
casting is your anglerfish.
now the one advantage to raw casting is that you can cast any spell that you know, even if it's of a higher circle than you normally can do. And so it is the only way to cast spells that are above your power level. But again, the more powerful the spell,
above your matrix, and above your matrix level,
and above your matrix level, you know, the more powerful the spell, the more damage you will take, the more likely it is that it will draw the attention of a horror if one is in the area. And just like raw casting is, generally speaking, is a bad idea, and only done in desperate or controlled circumstances.
In a best case scenario.
Yeah.
I've seen people try and do raw casting when they just thought it was I'll just try this. No, please don't try that.
Well,
I recommend to you, please don't try that.
One of the first long-term Earthdawn games that I ran, we had an elementalist, not elementalist, he was an illusionist in the group, who learned the spell Flying Carpet. And he was only 4th circle, and he wanted one, so he cast it with raw magic.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, in cases like that, I'm like, well, okay, here we go.
Well,
and I grab my dice and I look up stuff.
He did it in a safe area, so it wasn't a huge problem. It was actually more amusing by the reaction that the party wizard had when he showed up with it. Because the entry in the wizard's journal shortly after that was, I didn't think he was powerful enough to cast this spell, which means that either he's more powerful than I thought, or he did it with raw magic and is therefore like really stupid. Or or he did it with raw magic, which is also a troubling thought. So
well put.
So those are the three basic categories, and now we're going to sort of talk about the actual process of how you cast the spell. And this is the same, regardless of which of the methods that you use.
Yeah, there's technically a fourth, but we'll get to that a little bit later, which is blood magic. So it's not exactly how to cast a spell unless you're desperate. So we'll get to blood magic later. This is really
blood magic. We'll kind
the
of
three we want to cover today.
In a different episode, probably.
Yeah, these are the three we're going to cover today. Well, so I probably heard somebody in the background. Blood magic. No, we're going to get there later. It's gonna happen. Just shelve that for another episode.
So generally speaking, when you are bringing blood magic into spellcasting, what is happening typically is that you are using somebody else, voluntarily or otherwise, to act as a matrix. And so the actual process itself of casting the spell is not going to be any different. It's just basically, are you being nasty and forcing somebody else to take the raw magic damage that you would otherwise suffer for casting the spell.
So, okay. Just to know, a little pin in that one. Footnote on the blood magic.
Yeah, we'll another episode. We'll talk about blood magic.
Okay, so you're going to cast a spell. Congratulations, you got these three options. As you said, they pretty much work the same, depending upon what you're doing. So
We'll assume for the rest of this discussion that you are going to be casting a spell from a matrix.
Yes, that's a good way to put that. Threads. Took me a long time through first edition to realize that the thread is not part of the spell pattern. It is the power of the spell.
Yeah, this is the other nod to game balance a little bit when it comes to spellcasting in Earthdawn. And that is that it can take more than a round to cast a spell. Depending on how powerful it is, you might need to gather some additional energy beforehand before you can cast it. And that is, in one sense, what thread weaving is. In another, it's the simplified version of the spell that is in the Matrix is not enough on its own to cast the spell, so you need to bring a little bit of extra energy in to enlarge it before you can get the full spell pattern. But that's the base guide. I mean, we haven't really talked about patterns and stuff. We'll get to that in another episode as well. We're just kind of more concerned with the basic process. So thread weaving.
Exactly. Yeah, thread weaving. So you have your matrix all set, you need to power the spell. So a 0-thread spell doesn't require a whole lot more power than just your body can produce, really. And then you got a 1-thread spell, 2-thread spell, 3-thread spell. And as Josh said, those may take either more time or more oomph. So either a higher roll in certain cases to thread weave, or additional rounds to get those threads pulled together. I posted something a while ago on a forum for Earthdawn many years ago, because I finally took me literally 20 years to understand all of the processes involved. Thread weaving is the kind of like hand crank on the old meat grinder. A 0-thread spell can just pass through the meat grinder without a problem. 1 thread is one pass of the handle all the way around, 360 degrees, to get the meat grinder powered, to get the stuff pushed through it. So 2 threads, two cranks, 3 threads, 3 cranks, and so forth and so on. So that was my analogy I finally came up with.
That's not a bad analogy. Just generally the idea being that, and it's not quite as simple as all this, but basically that a 0-thread spell you can cast every round. There is no preparation or additional energy or anything that you need to do. Just every round you can cast the spell.
And technically you can just skip thread weaving on the 0-thread, because...
Right. There is no actual thread weaving step because it does not require additional threads. But you basically cast the spell every round. 0-thread spells generally are lower circle, relatively low effect. Like we mentioned back when we were answering Brian's question, that the Mind Dagger spell, for example, has 0 threads. So you can cast that every round, but it's willpower plus 2. So it's not a huge effect on that. And then generally speaking, every thread is an additional round of preparation, roughly speaking, that you would need in order to get it going. That's not a hard and fast rule, because there are some other factors that come into play, like how difficult is it to actually weave the threads, and what is the spellcaster's thread weaving talent step at. You know, like if it's only a difficulty 6 and you've got a thread weaving step of 13, odds are not only are you going to do it, but if it's got multiple threads, then you're going to be able to weave multiple threads on average with a typical roll. Because in 4th edition, every success that you score when you make your thread weaving test, and the thread weaving test is wizardry, elementalism, illusionism, or nethermancy are the four primary thread weaving talents. But you make the test with that, and each success weaves a thread. If you got more successes than you needed to successfully weave all the threads for the spell, congratulations. The extra successes, unfortunately, don't do anything for you. But that is possible. But like if it's a difficulty 6 and it requires 2 threads, if you roll an 11, you got both threads at once. And
6 plus 5, 11.
Right. Because every 5 over is the extra success. And that's that's thread weaving. So once you have all the threads woven, you get to actually put it into your matrix. Well, no. We're talking about the actual spellcasting process. So we're assuming the spell is already in the matrix, right?
Yes.
If you needed to weave threads for the spell, you weave the threads. And then
this is a long discussion. I kind of lost track of where we were.
Yeah.
So you weave your threads, and then you make your spellcasting test against your target.
Right. Which is usually the mystic defense of whoever it is that you're casting on.
Yeah. I loved it. It used to be called TSD, Target Spell Defense. Now it's Target's Mystic Defense. So, same thing.
Yeah. The change to Mystic Defense was to line it up with Mystic Armor, but it also had the nice thing of simplifying the abbreviations. So now PD is Physical Defense, MD is Mystic Defense, and SD is Social Defense. Whereas in previous editions, you would have SD for both Social and Spell Defense.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
So
so a little harder to figure out. And then you check your success level.
Right. And then each success, so your basic success, whatever the effect the spell has, happens.
Yeah.
Each additional success has additional effects in much the same way that extra successes on a melee weapons test with your sword do extra damage. asterisk successes on a spellcasting test will have an additional effect based on the spell. And it is different for every spell, although there are some trends that are noticeable in a lot of cases, especially for extended duration spells like especially like defensive buffs and so forth. Extra successes will generally extend the duration of the effect. It is not as frequent that extra successes will do extra damage on damaging spells, although many magician disciplines get a spell or two that does that, where it is a spell that is intended basically to just wreak havoc, and so extra successes will do extra damage. Look at Astral Spear for the Neithermancer, for example, does extra damage on successes, whereas Spirit Dart does not. Spirit Dart extends the duration of the mystic penalty that it inflicts.
Yeah. So most of your spellcasting, and so here's also the game balance part I have found trying to explain people who want to make a spellcaster because they think they're going to be able to do loads and loads and loads of damage, is that here's the game balance portion. If you're going to cast 0-thread spells, great. You can cast them all day long, one per round, you're all taken care of. If you want to cast anything more complex than that, thread weaving is one action for one round, and spellcasting is another action for another round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To talk specifically about 4th edition here for a little bit, and this is something that I think was true in earlier editions as well, but it was not, I think, necessarily explicit, and it was certainly not something that was as... and because it wasn't explicit, it caused, I think, some problems in some of the work that was tried to be done on 2nd and, to a lesser extent, I think 3rd edition, in terms of trying to balance and adjust and fiddle with spellcasters a little bit. Is that, and this is the design philosophy that we kind of approached 4th edition with, was that spellcasters are not going to be doing, certainly not at lower circles, are not going to be doing as much damage with their spells as a dedicated combat character. One of the reasons for that is that spellcasters have a lot more versatility. They have a lot more tools that they can use, both in terms of like combat buffs and debuffs, but also spells that are useful outside of combat. Utility spells like Crunch Climb or Levitation, and I may be listing spells that aren't currently in 4th edition right now.
Healing Sleep, things like that.
Yeah, Healing Sleep,
Uneven Ground,
Air Mattress, things like so. And so basically, the trade-off becomes you do sacrifice a little bit of power for greater versatility. Outside of combat, when a spellcaster is not under any kind of time pressure, a spellcaster can effectively bring any spell that they know to bear on a situation. And that versatility, I think, often got overlooked in some of the designs, in some of the work on earlier editions where things were focused so heavily on combat. Because it is where a lot of the rules are. People tend to focus on combat balance and purely combat balance. But there is a very intentional, not necessarily nerfing, but a very intentional, like, sort of scaling back of the amount of damage that a magician is going to be doing with their spells. Now, magicians get a couple of tools in their toolbox that combat characters don't. Magicians get access to area effect damage. Right, where you can cast spells. You don't necessarily get them right away, but you can get spells that will affect multiple targets at once. And that needs to factor in the balance in terms of how powerful they can be. You frequently have spells that are, you can cast spells. Frequently, those are going to be at range. And so you need to kind of balance, well, how close do they need to be to the target in order for this to be in effect? There's a lot of... There's a lot of art involved in trying to balance spells and trying to figure out what makes a good spell and how it works. And the idea that you can like create just a simple like sort of math system that will automatically spit out balanced spells is anytime that you try and like lock down a system like that, there are going to be exploits, and it will be very possible for people to break the system as a result. Generally speaking, magicians make up for a lack of maybe direct power, although I think most magician disciplines do get a spell or two when they get into higher circles that is just raw, unbridled thumping power.
Yes.
If they want to bring that to bear. But I really think, and I've always felt this was the case with like D&D spellcasters as well, is that people who are looking at spells for pure raw damage potential are missing the forest for the trees.
There was a cartoon I found once upon a time that says, I didn't ask what size the room was. It says I cast fireball. And people like that, I just look at and shake my head a little bit just to go, to your point, you're missing the forest for the trees on what you can actually do in other circumstances, or is this the right spell for the circumstance that I'm possibly in?
Yeah,
so.
The flexibility and versatility that a spellcaster brings to bear on the game just needs to be balanced by the fact that they just, in general, don't do as much raw damage. Because otherwise, why would you, if you're looking for raw damage, and the spellcasters do more damage, why would you play a swordmaster or a warrior or an archer when you can play a spellcaster that is going to be doing more damage than them?
Yes.
We really want to try and avoid the situation where the magicians completely overshadow the more traditional combat types when, in that situation. Because, again, balance is an art. Balance is, like kind of just getting a feel for how things roughly work together. But yeah, that's the philosophy. That is, you've got versatility and a broad array of choices and more tools that you can bring together. Because basically, in one sense, think of it like each spell is sort of like another talent that the magician can bring to bear on a situation. And as a result, magicians have a lot more talents. In a sense that they can bring. And so that you need to trade that off with something, and you trade it off with just raw power. Although there is plenty of opportunity for magicians to do raw power if they want, that is not their focus or purview. And people who go into magicians in Earthdawn with a thought towards being a combat mage, to being someone who's going to be slinging around like super powerful spells all the time, is apt to be disappointed, particularly if they are coming from a more traditional D&D style fantasy casting system, or any other system that has like not spell slots, but say like a mana pool that they spend points to cast spells and things like that.
Yeah. I do have a 3rd edition mage, and I did kind of focus him on combat, so I can help you along in this analogy. I did make a combat mage, and so my spells were primarily, as I had a rule with my game master, I said I need to make sure that my spells are combat oriented. And there's before combat prep, there is during combat, and there's recovering from combat. So my character does have healing sleep, so I can help my party recover after we have a combat. I have the proper buffs. I have some spells that I can do 0 threads that I can take care of at the time. And I have all of the ones for afterward as well. So if you're just wanting to do damage, that's one thing. I have a combat mage I'm prepared beforehand. I can buff my party beforehand. I can help them during the combat itself, and I can help them heal and take care of things afterwards. So,
yeah,
I mean, if you don't commit with that mentality, it's a different story. To your point,
you need to look at the, again, the magician is the utility infielder of Earthdawn.
Shortstop.
which is the utility infielder, and I may be mangling things here because I am not a huge baseball person, but the utility infielder is sort of the person who is not necessarily like awesome at any one particular thing, but is pretty good at a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
And so can kind of fill in where it's necessary. And I think players that look purely at the damage spells of magicians are losing sight of the other things that they can bring to bear, like the buffs or debuffs, like Iron Hand or Flame Weapon or Arrow of Night or
Combat Fury.
Defensively Air Armor or Shield Willow or Monstrous Mantle or like anything that you can do to support, enhance, or protect the people that are up front. Basically keeping the monsters from coming and chewing on your tasty innards. And that as the high perception characters traditionally, although not the only ones that will have a high perception, but magicians generally are the ones that will be bringing knowledge, certainly magical knowledge and whatnot. Again, looking at the group, at the adventuring party as a whole, and what each member contributes to that. You kind of need to look at it from that regard. Again,
I look at that, most combat-oriented disciplines, the warrior, the swordmaster, and so forth. I look at them as having the 16-color Crayola crayon box to play with. And I look at spellcasters as you've got the 16, but every spell you get, every circle of spells you get, you're adding on 4 to 8 other little colors. So eventually you're going to get to the 64-color crayon box, and that's pretty badass. Just you'll find a way to finagle and find the emphasis you can put to that character in which talents you can use. Because again, we're just talking spells. Magicians get talents too. That aren't just thread weaving and spellcasting. And reading and writing magic. Those are the 3 basics right there. But they get other ones as well, which we'll get into when we get to them individually. So they are also spells plus talents.
They're spells plus talents. And generally speaking, spells tend to be maybe a little bit more focused or limited compared to a talent. And I'm not going to say that that's universally 100% applicable. But generally speaking, because they get so many and have the potential, it's just something to keep an eye on. A couple of other things that I want to mention here with regards to spellcasting in general. I was talking about, players who go into magician disciplines with the idea of being a firebomber, like high damage, whatever, are apt to be disappointed. The other thing that you need to keep in mind when you're going to play a magician is patience. Because you have the preparation that is frequently required for thread weaving, where you're not going to be casting a spell every round. You need to understand that there will maybe be rounds where, unlike where the warrior is trying to hit something with his sword every round, you may just have a round where you are preparing to do something the next round. Now, we have in 4th edition added some additional tools where as you advance in circle as a magician, you get some tricks and abilities that allow you to get around some of those limitations. And we haven't talked about knacks at all, and we will talk about them more in depth another time. But we've added in some knacks for magicians that if you are weaving a thread, you can basically do a not even first circle magic level effect on somebody while you're doing it. Like, for example, the elementalist is an elementalist knack where if they're weaving a thread and they decide to use the knack, they can reduce a target's armor by 2. And it's only by 2. Doesn't matter how well they roll on it or whatever. It is only by 2. They basically get sort of the secondary effect of the Earthdawn spell that they can inflict on a target for 1 round. So, but it allows them to get a little bit of an additional, to maybe feel like they're contributing a little bit more, because that's another common complaint with magicians from earlier editions of the game. is that sometimes the number of threads that was required and the difficulty in weaving them could make it very frustrating to do stuff, especially if you spend 2 or 3 rounds preparing a spell and then cast it and it fails.
That is frustrating.
And so we've tried to provide some additional tools that allow a magician to at least feel like they are contributing without getting away from some of the fundamental like patience and planning and juggling complex stuff that is sort of fundamental to the magician play.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for something simple and blasty, magicians in Earthdawn are not actually what you're looking for. You're probably looking for an archer.
I am happily, this is not complaining at all. I'm going to pleasantly say, Earthdawn magicians of all stripes are pleasantly complex.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing for most gamers who enjoy that kind of an aspect of the game, which is, let me plan a little, but I still want to be able to react on the fly. Great, because magicians have that. I can plan this spell, I can plan that spell, I can get 2 or 3 ready for the combat, but if I need to, I can still reattune on the fly just because the situation has now changed, and I can react that way. A couple of movie references. I think actually I saw The Mummy with Brendan Fraser, and there's an example of casting from a grimoire in that movie. Because I think they're trying to banish the mummy again. And somebody's reading from the book, trying to do so.
Right.
So that's one example I've got right there. So if you need to connect with your players that way to get that done, you can at least reference that. I reference movies all the time because most of these, a lot of us have seen. If you want a visual representation of a spell matrix, like I said, I use the sausage grinder because it took me that long to figure it out. Because when you reattune, you have to change the blade at the end from the small holes to the big holes or whatever you're doing. However, I think the current Doctor Strange movie, where he's got these glowing discs around his wrists every time he conjures and uses his little gestures.
Yeah.
Those change. Those are not bad ideas to look at for how the Matrix would actually appear. Because I always thought they looked like an Indian dream catcher or Native American dream catcher.
Yeah. Or mandala designs like from the Asian subcontinent and stuff like that. So
if we've sufficiently confused you, by all means, let us know.
Yeah, I mean, really, we're at basically an hour now, and I only feel like we've sort of just barely scratched the surface of all of the stuff that can come into play with regards to magicians.
Agreed, because spellcasting
we didn't even get into the options of being able to like deciding beforehand extra threads, which was something that we added for 4th edition.
I was going to say, because if any previous edition didn't really get into at all the specifics of each individual spell, extra threads ahead of time or extra successes. So every single spell in 4th edition, I'm pretty sure, has the wherewithal to say extra successes ahead of time will get you this. And if you weave an extra thread, your options are 1, 2, 3, or 4. Do those. And state that ahead of time with the game master, what you would like to do. If you put an extra thread into your spell, what are your options?
Right.
And you can declare that ahead of time. So yes, I agree. We've just scratched the surface because this is the survival guide. So surviving as a spellcaster in Earthdawn is pretty simple. Get your matrix attuned ahead of time, put your spell into it, know what you're going to do, have a little bit of a plan. Plan always helps.
Yes.
Weave
especially
threads
for magicians.
So yeah, attune your matrices, plural. Weave your threads if necessary. Cast your spell. Roll your dice. Check your successes, and then go from there. And as we've answered Brian's question, yes, Flame Flash is pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's gonna do. It's short range. It requires a thread. So at first circle, at early circles, you're not going to be casting it every round. But it's decent damage, and it does it over 2 rounds. So it is a bit of a brutal spell.
Yeah, it's like a small short range hand grenade.
Yeah. Well, again, it's only a 10-yard range. So anything that you are going to be casting it on is potentially going to be able to close the distance
Yes.
So it is like there's the trade-offs there. Yeah, it's a little bit more powerful, but it is a short range.
Yeah, it's not getting anything very far away that way, but
Nope.
only within, not so much there. Since we have hit more than an hour, I think we're done with this episode because,
Yep.
as I said, spellcasting was going to take up the rest of this, and we knew it, and we've covered maybe a good 20% of it.
Yeah.
All the possibilities, because we took a whole bunch of things off the table and really didn't get into the specifics of Grimoire casting and the specifics of raw magic casting. We just kind of said, this is enough that you need to know, because primarily 90% of the casting you're going to do as a spellcaster at Earthdawn is through a matrix.
Yeah, certainly to start off, it is the way to go.
Yes.
Is just your standard matrix casting, and you weave the threads, you cast the spell, and you go from there. And the other tools that become available are more advanced and definitely worth looking into once you get the experience under your belt. But no, that is that. So yeah, we'll wrap up there tonight, I think. Mm-hmm. And now that we've gotten the really basics of combat and spell casting down, this will allow us to start our deep dives into specific disciplines, and then maybe different pieces of this will come up as we explore each of those.
Yeah, absolutely so. If you have been confused through this entire episode, because spellcasting is confusing, if we've not illuminated it, please ask us a question at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. If we have answered your questions, please let us know as well. If you have a better analogy than anything we've thrown at you, or a better movie reference than we've thrown at you, please by all means do so. If you've not seen Ronin, go do that. Has nothing to do with Earthdawn. It's just a really good flick. I will pump that hard. Otherwise, any final thoughts, Josh?
We have discussed, so we've been doing like bi-weekly episodes. We've been going every other week here with this, but we found that with our multiple topics, we tend to have been running long than what we'd originally planned. And so what we're looking at doing, and we will probably be trying to roll this out and see how it works in the new year, is still do our recording every other week like we have been. Yeah. But basically take our sort of two topics and actually just break those up into two episodes. So the individual episodes will hopefully, maybe be shorter.
This one notwithstanding.
But we will basically be releasing, an episode focused on each topic or two, depending, every week is what we're looking at. Because we've been averaging, looking at the numbers here now, we've been running, this will be episode 7. Looking at whatnot, we've got an average listenership. Our numbers are estimating about 100 listeners, which is not bad.
Nice. I'll take that. That was double my last podcast.
With
at its best.
So that's good. And I think that if we can figure out how to maybe get content out more regularly without needing to add on a whole lot of extra work. And I think just basically breaking up what has been, one long hour and 15, hour and 20 minute episode into two 30 to 40 minute 45. Episodes, might end up. We'll see what happens. That's what we're looking at, and we'll go there. People have also asked about, just in general, we haven't gotten emails about it, but mentioned it to me on Twitter or Discord
forums
and things like that. Is the possibility of getting guests on, to possibly if we could set up an interview with Lou, or something like that. And it's certainly something that we could potentially do. But we haven't looked into the logistics of how to do that just yet.
We've barely figured this part out. Yeah, the two of us.
Yeah, but I mean, it's certainly something that would be, that I'm sure would be interesting. I have spoken to Lou both online and in person multiple times over the years, but I'm sure that Dan would be thrilled to talk and ask questions and whatnot.
I've never actually met Lou. Would be honored to do so, and that's just me as a fan. So, because I love the creation he started. So, yeah,
and other and other people in the community.
He's the George Lucas of Earthdawn. Come on.
Oh, I don't know that I would go that far. I mean, in one sense, perhaps. Although I'm sure he, like me, would be happy to say it was absolutely a team effort and
team
would
effort,
not have been
yes.
happened without all of the other wonderful creatives that were involved. But
we wouldn't have Star Wars without John Williams.
You know,
or
it is something
Ben
that
Berger.
we will, you know, now that we've sort of got half a dozen episodes here and have at least maybe started to get a feel for how this is going to work, might look into that in the future. But that'll do it for, I don't have anything else to say. So
Fair enough. All right, folks. That's it for this week. About an hour and 10. Not bad for us overall. A little shorter than last time. We'll try and be quicker about it next time. And otherwise, thank you for listening, everyone. Go make your own legend.
good night.